happy to have you. And we just want to cheer you again before we get rolling. This certainly, I mean, you all know, has been a year like no other, and 2 school years, bridging 2 school years. So we just want to give you a big pat on the back and a huge cheer for all the work that you're doing. Thank you. This is our October virtual workshop, and some of you are with us in September, so thanks for coming back again. And this time we'll do introductions again, so you could actually go ahead and start putting into the chat your name, the school that you're with, the position you have there, and your role with the Learning Garden. And Colleen can type those instructions in the chat so you have it as a reminder. If you want to share your pronouns as well, you're welcome to add that on your name or in the chat. And this time we'll start with a group share again after our introductions on the topic of in-class tastings. We're going to have a couple case study type examples to share for some tips and best practices for in-class or garden tastings. We'll have I'll talk a little bit about harvesting, finishing out your harvest, and doing some winter prep. We'll have some time for questions, and then we'll close with our raffle again and survey. And I think it might be that everyone's going to get something in the raffle today. So yay, you get a prize just for attending. Moving on. And are you all sharing in the chat? Because remember, I can't see when I'm.
Yes, they are very conscientious and good at following instructions. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all for doing that. That'll just help us partly have a record of who was here, since we don't have a sign-in sheet as well. So I think that we will jump right in. Again, we wanted to start with some time for you to share. So like we did last month, we're going to use the Padlet, but our focus is a little bit different. So this month we're interested in, hopefully everyone on the call is getting some produce out of your garden, or you did, maybe until just recently. And we would like to hear more about how that produce has been used and whether or not you have been doing any in-garden or in-class tastings. And if not, is it because of COVID or for other reasons? And what might help make in-class tastings easier or smoother for your school or more possible? So Colleen, if you can drop the Padlet link into the chat, I am going to also pop it over and show you what it looks like.
The questions are already populated on the Padlet, and then you just click under each question to add your answer.
So we'll take a few minutes. You can turn off your camera if you prefer to not have people watching while you type, and you should now you should see a plus sign under each of those questions. Yeah. And so it does sound like there are a few of you that have been doing tastings in class or planning to. So if you haven't done it yet, hopefully you'll get some good tips here coming up. Okay, great. I'm going to go back to our slides here, and I'm going to turn it over to Colleen to talk a little bit more about what's been happening in some other schools.
Yes, thanks, Laura. So actually, I am going to pass the baton over to Andy Conkle. He volunteered to share about his experience. This is a new garden that we kicked off, this year, August 20th. So today is the 2-month anniversary of the Learning Garden at Clinton Young. Happy 2-month anniversary. And I am just so impressed. I mean, they have the good fortune that Andy is a master teacher, so not a classroom teacher, which we've said, all along, that if you can have someone on your garden team who doesn't have their own classroom, it offers a lot more flexibility as far as leading and doing these activities. So Andy, do you mind sharing a little bit about your experience?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, great. Well, we've had a great experience the last 2 months, and we've done classroom tastings. I've tried it 3 different ways, and I definitely have a favorite way. Um, we did a harvest one day, and then we bagged everything up, refrigerated it, and then did the tasting with a different grade level the next day. Um, we've done harvesting and then bagged things up, cleaned everything, bagged it, and then delivered it to classrooms. And they've done the tasting in their classroom. And then my favorite way that we did last 2 weeks ago, we had a class come out and harvest. We cleaned everything, and then that same day, a different class came out to the garden and tasted, and we kind of went through and showed everything and how it was grown in the garden. So we've tried 3 different ways and learned a lot this fall.
So I sent you some questions, and I'm always curious to hear because, like, I know every time I try something new, then I'm surprised or there's something I didn't expect. So what did you encounter?
Yeah, I mean, I think that first question there, I wrote that in the Padlet as well. It is nice that I have the flexibility and it does allow us to include more grade levels. We can get more kids out in the garden because my schedule is a little more flexible. Um, but I do need to be better about we have 15 people on our garden team. I need to be better about using those folks to help support and be out in the garden. One of our, Kim is on the call, I know right now, one of our garden team members. So her classes helped with watering and done a great job. So I have delegated some things, but need to be better about doing that. And then the other question there that you ask, definitely we prefer doing the tastings when kids came out to the garden rather than in the classroom, because they could be out there seeing. It makes that connection of this is what was grown and then this is what you're tasting.
And they always ask about it too. If the class that's harvesting is like, do we get to eat this?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's who's most excited about trying it, are the kids who
Yes.
harvested it, for sure. Thank you, Andy, for sharing that experience and those pictures. And that's the garden kit, which all of you should have. If you need another salad spinner, let us know. We have plenty. So if you find that to be a limitation, I went out to Lakeside today and I was harvested their fall garden. This garden was kicked off a year ago, I think. And it has been growing fairly well. We did a plant parts tasting. So this is a way I just really quickly, I had a few minutes after harvesting to be able to rinse the vegetables using the salad spinners. And you can see the baby carrot there, the little baby turnip, a little bit of dill, some cilantro, and Swiss chard leaf. So I told them, I prepared them all that we're gonna pass out these little tasting portions and that they were all going to eat it at once. And we also talked about how we can influence each other by the way we express ourselves. And so I did a little role playing, well, if I am upset about something, and I act upset, you're going to feel that and it's going to change how you experience something. And if I'm excited about something and super happy, then same thing. So we talked about trying to wait before we showed those reactions to allow folks to just kind of get into the flavor, get into the experience and the sensation of eating that. So these were kindergartners and they were amazingly well behaved. They all stayed at their desks. We passed out the sample. I told them to use all of their senses and then to when we were ready to taste it, to just take a little tiny nibble and then to eat it. And then afterwards we talked about, and we did a poll. So that was another thing we put up on the board and had them raise their hands if they liked it or if they didn't like it. And it was the best I've ever seen kindergartners react to new flavors. There was none of the dramatic, that kind of stuff. They really did a great job. And then after the little, and I told them, I said, this is mindful because your mind is full of the experience of this new taste and this new texture and this new vegetable. And so there was, I warned them there were strong flavors and told them to take small bites, and they were great. And then afterwards, we did the plant dance to review the plant parts. And I sometimes think that, like, as kids get older, I mean, kindergarten always loves the plant dance, but I've noticed, like, older kids, and especially once they've had a garden for a while and they've done the plant dance before, it brings some continuity into those garden activities, that they remember it. And I've had like 4th and 5th graders like ask me if we're going to do it. So if you don't know the plant dance, talk to Laura and we can show it to you, but it's a great way
time at the end of the session today.
Yeah, to review the plant parts and the plant life cycle. Then we talked about which plant parts we ate. They were kindergartner. I made them repeat the names of the vegetables and like say the first sounds and the ending sounds, and just again to draw that connection that we're learning here, and we're learning about so much more than just growing and eating vegetables. So it was really fun.
I have a question for Andy. How did you get 15 people on your garden team?
I saw the look on your face when you said that.
That's impressive.
I didn't really take a lot. We have an awesome staff, and I just, when we applied for the grant, got the grant, and then the garden was being built, that's when we kind of asked for help. And
actually, I think probably the best way to build more participation on a garden team is to have Colleen or myself to work with you to create an event or activity for staff so that they get to come out and experience it and get excited about it. But it may also be, knowing what in your school might be the hook. Like, are people looking for experience, like hands-on learning opportunities? Are they, looking for reasons they can take their class outside that are approved by administration? All right, so from the tasting, before you can taste it, you have to harvest it. So, and Angie, your question about, being able to identify when, if it's your first time, is a great question.
Yes.
I did not put photos in for that, but I can give you some tips of what to look for. And I can come out to 48 or look at the photos y'all have if you've got recent photos in your drive folder. And
I don't.
Okay, well, I'll try to get out there this week and have a look.
Yeah,
So,
we'll be back next week.
Great. So Colleen talked about this some last week, but we just sort of wanted to review that we've been taking 2 primary approaches to how to harvest with students this year, if you are harvesting with students. And one, which is different than what we've done in the past, is to actually have students have their own container or bag that they are harvesting into, and they keep what they harvest. So what they touch goes to them, and there's less than, cross-contamination points of people touching things that other people are going to take home. And then the other primary method is what we have done really in the past, which is one large kind of bulk harvest. Say you're harvesting carrots, all the carrots go into, all the students pull their carrots, put them in the same bucket, they get rinsed, and then they get divided. Or all the carrots are cutting greens into one bucket. So it's really up to your school to decide what works best for you. And you can use so these are just a couple pictures of what that might look like, whether you're harvesting in one individual container or in a shared bucket. And you don't have to use the same method throughout the school necessarily. So, Angie, if you take a class out and you want each student to harvest into their own bag or their own container and take home what they harvest, you can do that. And Melissa or another teacher there could do a bulk harvest.
Got it.
So the primary things that you're going to be harvesting at this time of year, especially if you just planted a fall garden. So some of you may still have some tomatoes and peppers that are ripening or even still producing. It's been a little bit cold, so they may be not really producing anymore, and you may just have some that are still there to ripen. We'll talk about that here in a few minutes, but probably the bulk of what is remaining to harvest will be, and especially for those who planted a fall garden only, you're going to have root vegetables and greens. So we'll talk about the root vegetables first. And really the key is, and I recommend that you do clean the dirt off your root vegetables before they go into the school. It's less messy to do it in the garden than it is to take them into a sink in the building. You're just going to get so much dirt in that sink. So,
Sorry, I was going to say, like, I just sprayed them in the bucket a couple of times and poured out the water.
That's what I'm going to talk about. So I think, if you clean a few at a time, rather than if you've harvested like a whole bucket or a half bucket of radishes, if you're trying to clean all of those at once, it's going to be really messy. So if you have your salad spinner, even, you can take, 10 to 12, put them in your salad spinner or some other kind of bucket or container that has holes in it that you have sanitized. It's a food safe container for this. And then turn your spray nozzle to flat and get pretty close so that it's actually spraying the dirt off of the vegetables. Toss them around a little bit, spray them again. And then I usually, if you're doing your root vegetables in the salad spinner or in some sort of other container with holes where you're going to be shaking it, I would recommend you take all the greens off first. So all you have in the bucket are the roots. The greens are just gonna, especially when they get sprayed, they're just gonna get messy over the root vegetables. Another method, especially for carrots, that we used to do when I worked on a larger scale urban farm is, and I can help you with ideas of where you might get crates like this, or if you have milk crates or something. The idea with the holes, it doesn't necessarily have to have holes, but it'll just help keep any water from pooling. And so you want to, again, clean well, like sanitize the surface. I sanitize these crates and then set them up and had students lay their carrots out. Ideally, you get all of the greens going one direction and the roots facing another direction, so they're all lined up in the same way, with the greens away from the person who has the spray nozzle, so that as you're spraying onto the roots and the greens are going the other direction. Does that make sense? The direction of the water and the direction of the greens go the same way. It's a little easier to leave the greens on while you're spraying your carrots or other root vegetables this way, because then you can use the greens to flip them over and get the other side. And then once you have them clean, you can just tear the greens off of the roots. So you can do that whether you take the greens off before or after. And that method I did at a school last week, and it worked, or 2 weeks ago, it worked really well. And I was glad that I remembered that was something we used to do when I worked on an actual urban farm. So I'll pass that tip on to you. And then with your greens, now, whereas I said I recommend getting the dirt off your root vegetables in the gardens, your greens, you may find it much easier to not try to get them in a wet environment in the learning garden. And Andy, you may have experienced this, or others of you who've harvested with students in the past. So as long as it's cool outside and the leaves are dry, you don't need to rinse them in the garden, because whether you clean something in the garden or not, it's going to need to be cleaned again before it's eaten. So even if you do it in the garden, it should be done again before it's eaten, is our recommendation. That would be the best practice. Now, if it's hot outside, the reason that you put greens in water when it's hot outside is to actually bring down the temperature of the leaves themselves. So in farming terms, it's called hydrocooling. You're not washing them, you're hydrocooling them, which just helps understand the concept of why you're doing it. You're using the water to cool the vegetables down. And with greens, because they're so tender, if you don't do that, if you harvest them when it's warm, they're more likely to be wilty when it's warm out as well. Whereas when it's cool, they're not working so hard to keep the hydration through the plant. They don't have the sun seeping that energy out in the same way. So as long as they're dry and it's cool outside, then you really don't need to worry about hydrocooling or rinsing your greens in the garden. You can harvest them either into the individual bag that a student's going to take and keep their own, or you can do a bulk harvest and then bag it. And it's a good idea to have students, and it's always a good idea to have a more mature set of eyes assisting in this process to look for dead or yellowed or leaves that, one, you're not going to want to eat, and two, they're already starting to decompose essentially. And so if you put matter in there that's breaking down, it's going to make everything else around it rot faster as well. Yes.
Can I offer something, Laura?
Yeah.
So I would include that in your demonstration and explanation of the harvesting activity, and even asking the kids, like, if you saw this leaf in your salad, would you want to eat it? And to and reminding them to tune their mind to that this is food, and would I want this on my plate? And if the answer is no, don't put it in the bag.
Yeah. That may also help encourage them to be more conscious of whether they're getting dirt when they're cutting their leafy greens as well. Would they want to eat that dirt? So again, similar with the root vegetables, cleaning a smaller amount at once. Don't fill your salad spinner all the way up. It's going to be really hard to spin the water off. So do smaller batches. And if you are doing that inside, which will be an easier thing to do, you do want to make sure that you're using a sanitized, like a large sink that's sanitized. And I will usually have my greens in the container that, the colander part that goes in the salad spinner. And that whole thing goes in the solid bowl, fill some water so you can kind of oscillate it with the water to get extra dirt and things off. Then pull the colander out, let the water drain, empty the solid bowl, put your spinner back in, and then spin it. So that's kind of the method that I prefer. And you can do that a couple of times if it happens to have recently rained or it's drizzling a little bit when you're clean out with students, just to help get extra dirt off. And then both your greens and your root vegetables should be refrigerated after you've harvested and bagged them. And I didn't say this before, but the reason, and this is a fun conversation to have with students too, why would you remove the leaves from the root vegetables before you store them? Anyone besides Colleen have an idea as to why?
Something about their nutrients being connected to them and they need them.
Well, it does have to do with the function of the plant parts. And we want to take the greens off. Any other guesses? So the root, what does the root help absorb for the plant?
Is it nutrients?
That's one thing. And there's a second thing. We ask the students, how do plants drink water?
For their roots.
Through their roots. So the root is the first part of the plant that is absorbing the water, bringing moisture into the plant. And from there, where does that water go? It goes from the root into
The leaves?
I don't know. The stems and the leaves. So the root is kind of like the water pack for the stems and the leaves. So when you pull a root vegetable out of the ground, the root is holding kind of the reserves of the water for the plant. And the stem and the leaves are going to continue to want to draw on that water. So if we leave the leaves on, and you may have had this experience at a farmer's market where you've bought a bunch of carrots or something and they're a little like rubbery, and that's because, or even if you bought them from the store, that's because the leaves, the stems have continued to draw that water from the root out because the rest of the stem and the leaf want it. So when you remove the stem and the leaves from the root vegetable, then that water does not get pulled out of the root, and the root keeps its crispness and firmness better. And then refrigerating it inside a bag will also help to retain that moisture. So there you go. Now you've also learned tip for your own produce storage at home today. But it's fun to have students try to think that one through. And you helps if they've learned about the function of parts of plants to be able to answer the question. Colleen, anything you want to add there?
Yes. So there's a super fun experiment that you could do on a warm day with a Ziploc bag and put it over a leaf outside. It could be a tree leaf. It could be a leaf in your garden, something like just put the Ziploc bag over that leaf or that branch with leaves on it, come back, and there will be water in the bag after a few hours. And that is because of this process that Laura is describing called transpiration.
I always rely on Colleen for the scientific terms of things. This is why I...
So hard for me to not like just jump in there, but you did a great job explaining it.
Thank you. I like teaching the younger kids that use less scientific terms. All right, so what else might be in your garden? You may still have some tomatoes, peppers. Some of you might have some strawberries or melons or squash still out there. You probably have herbs, assuming you had herbs to begin with. And you may even still have some flowers. So most things are going to be okay until there's a first frost, or, I mean, the peppers and tomatoes will not really continue to produce, and they're not going to really ripen all that well, but they're going to be okay on the vine. You can take your tomatoes off the vine and store them with the stem side down on like a piece of cardboard or even some kind of like mesh or screen. The better airflow is going to help prevent the tomato from rotting, and they will ripen off the vine. So back before we had a child, my husband and I picked like all our tomatoes, including cherry tomatoes, and left them all to ripen. And we had fresh tomatoes for Thanksgiving, and we were really proud of ourselves. So, but that's another fun thing that you can do with students, and take the tomatoes into the classroom, put them in a window on a piece of cardboard or something, and let them watch those tomatoes ripen off the vine. They can see if they think they're better, the same, or not as good as the ones fresh off the vine. Your melons will not continue to ripen off the vine, nor will squash. So those are either going to be ripe, or you might feed them to a class pet or something like that. And Colleen, if you don't know what to do with your herbs, reach out to Colleen or reach out to me, and I will connect you to Colleen. She is the herb queen and knows all kinds of great ideas, and we'll cover herbs more in our November workshop, probably some fun things you can do.
Can I ask a really quick herb question?
Absolutely.
Is there any chance that rosemary will continue to grow if we pull it out of the ground and put it in water?
No, you could try to dig it up and put it in a pot and take it inside.
Okay.
But it needs the soil.
You could try, I mean, it depends on your microclimate, but you could try putting like a cut milk jug or a bucket or something over the plant through the winter that offers some insulation and might keep the temperature up a little bit higher and give you a better chance of it surviving over the winter. But you can also dig it up and overwinter it inside, but it does need the soil.
Yeah, rosemary, for those of you who don't know, does not reliably survive Indiana winters. So I'm going to let Colleen do a quick overview of some fun seed saving you can do if you've got seeds, especially from your herbs in a garden.
Yes, so these pictures are cilantro and dill seeds that I saved from Learning Gardens this year, and I've already used them to plant. And so I love seed saving. It's a really fun hobby and a good project for students I know at Central in Beech Grove. That was one of the things she told me she was planning on doing. So we did a walk through the garden and looked at the different things. And so there's, first you want to consider what is your goal with seed saving. Are you trying to gather them as a spice or like coriander or dill for pickling? Do you want to save them to plant in the next season, or do you want to do some other kind of project with them or experiment with them? So many different cool things that you can do. And so once you figured out kind of what you want to do with them, then you can go out and decide what you're gonna harvest and how you're gonna store them. Dill and cilantro will bolt and send up a flower pretty reliably. If you don't harvest them, or even if you do, they'll find a way. And once those flowers start to turn brown, then you'll see the seeds forming on the end of the flowers. And you want them to be nice and brown before you harvest them. You can cut off the whole flower head, or you can try and strip the seeds off. Either way, mustard, kale, radish, turnips, they're all the same plant genetically. They just, varieties of those gene expressions create the variety of vegetables that we have. And they're biennials, which means they don't produce a flower till the second year. So if you wanted mustard seed for cooking, and it's a very tiny seed, so, but it has a really good flavor if you want to cook with it, and you can save it to grow the vegetables the next year. They put on a little pod that you probably have seen if you left some turnips or radishes unharvested. So if you want to leave some of those over the winter, then they'll put up a flower next spring probably, and you'll get some seeds next year from them. Sunflowers, obviously common seed that we eat, and I've seen those grown very successfully in learning gardens. And with those, the birds love them. So that's another good use for the seeds, is to make bird feeders or leave them out. So if you don't want to harvest the seeds, you can just leave them there and the birds will come and eat them. Beans and peas will often go seed ripe. That's what you call it when your peas and beans get too big to eat, and they're fibrous and starchy and just not that great. Those will also dry on the vine, and those are fun for kids to collect and to shell because they're bigger. And so those can be saved, used for crafts, or the seed experiment where you germinate and look at the parts of the seed. Beans and peas are great for that because they're so big. So, sometimes folks see their garden and it's like all dried up, or they forgot to harvest something and it got really big. Not all is lost. There's still valuable material out there to explore. So check and see if you've got, seeds. These I listed because they're pretty easy to get. Peppers and tomatoes and those other things that have like a lot of fleshy fruit around them are more difficult and challenging to save and the process. So if you want more details, or if you're interested in that, you can let me know. And then, like I said, make sure they're completely dry before you put them in a closed container. So you can just dry them in like a paper bag that's open, or we have like a drying rack here at our house. So and I'm happy to share any of these extra seeds. If you guys need any dill seed, I have enough.
Thanks, Colleen. Are there any questions about anything we covered with harvesting or the seed saving before we cover what do you do when you're done harvesting? So once you are done harvesting for the season, then what happens to the garden? So we talk about putting the garden to bed for the winter. I don't really know where that term comes from, other than we grow in garden beds. I'm not really sure. But the idea really is that you want to think about how you're going to help continue to cultivate health for the soil for the next growing season, and also to retain soil in your beds. So if you did nothing, let's say you removed all your plants and you just had empty beds, what do you think might be the two downsides to that? Or they're probably not the only two, but the primary two that we talk about.
Soil depletion, like wind will blow it away, and
Yes, that's right. So you have wind erosion. Our soil relies on microbial life to help with the nutrient transfer to what we plant there. So like we want soil that is alive. And part of the idea of covering the soil for the winter is, one, you prevent that wind erosion, but two, you create a more hospitable habitat for microbial life in the soil to stay, so that they don't essentially freeze out as well over the winter. Colleen, if I just get anything totally inaccurate, if I'm spreading false information here.
No, it's all right. I dropped in the chat a link to an awesome YouTube video that just goes through, in a great way with visuals for kids, how this plant matter literally feeds the microbes in the soil, and that over time, by removing that layer of plant debris, the soil microbes starve. And so if you want to get into this with your kids, especially when there's not much growing in the garden, reminding them that it's still alive, I think this video is like 10 minutes or something, but I highly recommend it.
Yeah. So we have in the past had some alfalfa straw that we've been able to give out to schools. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to do that this year. But there's still a couple of other ways that you don't need to go buy straw to cover your garden beds. There's a couple other options. So one is that you can leave, let's say you've had your root vegetables, those beds are going to be pretty empty and will need to be covered with something. But if you've had greens growing, when you do the final harvest, there's still going to be some leaves there, and there's still going to be root systems intact. And so you can just leave all of that and not pull it out. If you have had pepper plants and tomato plants and things like that growing, other larger plants, you can I would recommend having students break up or cut up that material, not leaving a whole solid pepper plant, but kind of tearing or making those pieces smaller and spreading it out over the top of the bed to help create a layer there on top of the soil. You can have students collect leaves around the schoolyard, get rakes and rake up leaves around the schoolyard and spread those on the bed. Or if the folks who do your lawn, the facilities folks or whoever's mowing the lawn, if they're willing to collect it with the mower bag, if that's an option, and then they can dump it by the garden or put it on the garden, depending on whether you want to have students do that or not. So there's lots of free resources for material to cover your garden beds. The one thing that you do want to just be aware of is you can also use grass clippings. If they're mowing the lawn, you can use grass clippings. But ideally you want to avoid using grass that gets like chemically treated, because you don't want to introduce that into the garden environment. So it's really, it's really pretty straightforward. I know that having students rake leaves is not always a priority, but it could be part of physical activity time, part of recess, an activity for those who would be interested in helping get the garden ready. So other ways to work it in. And again, you can also leave plants that are growing and they will mulch themselves. The strawberries would appreciate you mulching them. They would prefer that you not put whole leaves because that'll just kind of mat down. So either maybe if somebody does have straw bale left over from fall decorations, you could use that around your strawberries, or leaves that have been kind of mowed over. So they're lighter and looser. You could cover your strawberries that way. But they will come back next year, even if you don't, unless we have like maybe a polar vortex or something, they might not. But generally, we've seen strawberries come back regardless of whether they've been mulched or not. Any questions about that or anything you want to add, Colleen?
Just because as a garden educator, I get really excited about ways to, I guess, keep the interest and excitement alive, even what appear to be boring and cold times in the garden.
Yeah.